where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is 9:08 p.m. in the very dark, cold, wet city of Budapest, with rain falling all day, to remind you of the grim, dark, dismal, dreary, depressing days that are coming. And so, if you want to, wallow in the dismal short days that characterize life here in Budapest during the fall and winter, today is the day to give you a good, strong sense of that. Now, starting off on this depressing note, let's raise the level to a more cheerful note. Thank you very much, everybody. Somebody said here, Ahmadovich Nas says, I like short day. That's very strange. I mean, are you an alcoholic? I mean, I guess if you're an alcoholic, short days make sense because then evening sets in early, and evening is always a good excuse to start drinking. So, if you like your alcohol, then it's nice. 3 o'clock, you can open up your a nice bottle. Um, so, uh, obviously, there are a number of things to talk about, particularly with regard to Trump, Russia, and Ukraine, and especially all the myriad pronouncements that have been issued by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, explaining very clearly what Russia's position is on Ukraine and security guarantees. I see Ivan Grozny is here. Hello, George. Hello, Ivan. Um, but before we get to that, there's a couple of other things that I want to talk about, which because we spent quite a lot of time now talking about Ukraine, and we will talk about Ukraine, but maybe talk about something a little different. First of all, obviously, there's the good news in Washington, well, or rather in New York, that that idiotic $500 million fine against Donald Trump has now been dismissed by the court, by an appellate court, as being in violation, as if we needed to be told, in violation the of the Peter Kovic says, "What do you think of Trump's new saber rattling with Venezuela?" I don't think much of it. He seems to have gone back to his shtick from his first term, and we had thought that he'd put all that behind him because that was all done by John Bolton, because Bolton was national security advisor when Trump decided to go for that regime change and decided to withhold recognition from President Maduro. He was not the legitimate president. Trump decided, and they decided that Guaido was the legitimate president of Venezuela, and then they tried a couple of coups, which failed, and now he's doing some saber rattling, sending in destroyers, and claiming, without a scrap of evidence, that somehow Maduro is in charge of drug running, and responsible for the drug epidemic in the United States. I mean, there's no evidence for that whatsoever. This kind of saber rattling isn't going to impress anyone. Certainly not going to impress Maduro, and makes really very little geopolitical sense in any case for Trump, since you want to base. I mean, if you're going to wage some kind of a war on Russian oil, which I think is he wants to curtail Russian oil exports because he wants to curtail Russian revenues. It's not a great idea to antagonize, Venezuela. So if you're antagonizing Venezuela, then you basically are only going to help Russia. So it doesn't really make a great deal of sense. But anyway, So on that issue, I think I have no sympathy at all for Trump. I do have sympathy for all the lawfare that was waged against him, and because in nearly every case, we spent a lot of time discussing all of the civil suits and the criminal charges that were leveled against him, and they were all, every single one was absolutely ridiculous on its face. So we got, when we had the civil cases, we had that loony woman who claimed that Trump had raped her and she couldn't even remember the year, 1994, 1995, 1996. But she made no criminal filing at the time, but decided to bring it up because she wanted to sell her memoirs. And of course, she made a lot of money. And of course, that triggered a kind of a change in the law in New York State to enable her to bring a civil suit against him. And of course, in New York, with its absolute hatred for Trump, she won, even though she had not any evidence whatsoever that Trump had raped her. So that was that. But nonetheless, the court ruled in her favor and hit Trump with some ridiculous fine. I think it was about $90 million or something. And then there was this case, which was done by the Letitia James, Big Tish James, who may soon herself be in some trouble, claiming that Trump had defrauded somebody or other. She couldn't even name whom Trump had supposedly defrauded by overvaluing the value of his holdings. Now, apart from anything else, it's always very difficult to get an exact estimate of what the value of one's holdings is. But in any case, everybody, that's the way business is done. And the people with whom Trump was doing business, like Deutsche Bank, these were sophisticated, financial players, and they're not going to accept at face value, any client's claims for the value of their holdings. So all of that that were being raised, and so yes. So Robert says Lavrov. Oh no, I missed it. Well, I'll get back to it a little bit later. So there was a real ridiculous issue there, and they hit him because Deutsche Bank had not claimed that Trump had defrauded it. In fact, nobody had claimed that Trump had defrauded them, nor even New York State did not claim that Trump had defrauded the New York State and by underpaying taxes or anything. So it was she brought a fraud case without actually presenting a victim, somebody who had been defrauded. But with that Arthur Engeron, he hit Trump with an absolutely ridiculous fine, and now it's gone up to over $500 million through penalties and so on. So that was that's now been thrown out, which is rather good news. And the one other thing is, of course, today is August the 21st, which to the cognoscenti would know that August the 21st is, of course, the day on which the Soviet Union intervened militarily in Czechoslovakia. That was in 1968, so that's 57 years ago. And what I think is interesting, because at the time, of course, the Soviet Union was much demonized by everybody, as this, raping this small country. But in retrospect, you'd have to say that the Soviet leaders behaved fairly reasonably and with some restraint in 1968. So, for anyone who hasn't followed it, what happened. January 1968, longtime Czechoslovak communist leader is replaced by Alexander Dubček. And Dubček clearly, starts, going down this path of, liberalizing communism. Now, that moment of liberalized communism had already come and gone. They tried a little bit of that in the 1950s and in the early 60s in the Khrushchev era. And Peter Kovic says Trotsky died 75 years ago. Now, I don't want to be be a stickler about this, but it's actually 85 years ago. So it was 1940 that he was killed. But yeah, in principle, yes, that was, but it was 85 years ago. And anyway, but anyway, so Dubček takes over, and he institutes these reforms. And the Soviet leaders are obviously very unhappy about this, and begin issuing warnings to Dubček fairly early on. I mean, this is by March 1968. They already issue a very stern warning that they're not happy with the direction that things are heading in Czechoslovakia. And then Dubček, a kind of fairly ineffectual sort of figure, tries to keep the Soviet leaders happy, but then he tries to keep the people in Czechoslovakia happy. So he promises the Soviet leaders that he's going to get his hands around this liberalization and the reforms, but he doesn't do it. And so things kind of deteriorate, and the Soviet leaders continue to issue warnings that they're not very happy with how things are going in Czechoslovakia. Even more troublesome for Dubček was that the other East European communist leaders were also warning him and saying, well, we're not very happy with what's going on here. This isn't, you're undermining socialism. Now, the problem for the Soviet leaders as 1968 moved on was that Czechoslovakia really was a very strategic piece of real estate. Remember, on the west, it borders West Germany, and on the east, it borders the Soviet Union. So if Czechoslovakia is lost to the Warsaw Pact, then that's a major geostrategic calamity for the Soviet Union. So that's why they were taking this very seriously, and they were making clear to Dubček that that he had to bring this Prague Spring to an end, and then they had a big meeting at the border for several days. It was several days meeting with the party leaders, the Czechoslovak party leaders, and the Soviet party leaders. I think it was a Chernik. I can't remember the exact name. It was right on the border for several days. And as was their wont, Dubček said, "Yeah, sure, we'll bring everything under control." The Soviet leader said, "All right, well, then that's fine. See that you do." And of course, Dubček failed to follow through. And then a few days later there was the Bratislava Declaration, about socialist unity, which and this was all of the communist leaders took part in the Bratislava Declaration, and Dubček himself took part in it, and it was clear though that Dubček really wasn't able to bring things under control. Now, the problem I mean, as I said, for the Soviet Union, this is a major strategic issue. They cannot lose Czechoslovakia. So that was already out of the question. And there's people going around talking about Czechoslovakia withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact. Maybe so. Um, but what I think that the Czechoslovak leaders didn't realize, and what, of course, many people didn't realize in the West, that the Soviets had regarded what they did in 1956 in Hungary as very successful. They were obviously condemned in the world media, and denounced the brutality and so on. But nonetheless, that was obviously a very successful operation. They brought the Hungarian uprising to a close, and and they dealt, of course, very brutally and ruthlessly with the leaders of the Hungarian uprising. Chiefly Imre Nagy, who was tried and executed, and but others were also tried and executed. So it was they dealt with it very brutally. Um, but the Soviets regarded that as very successful, and it was very successful for all its um, undoubted sort of nastiness and viciousness. Um, the problem that they had on their hands then, with the threat of loss of Hungary, was addressed, and they managed to insert in place a leadership that proved to be very effective. This is Kada. Would prove to be one of the Soviet Union's sort of most effective and shrewd satellite leaders. So, so Czechoslovakia really had very limited options. Because the Soviet Union, first of all, has said, if we intervene, it worked for us in '56. It's going to work for us now. And you saw that in '56, no Western powers came to your assistance. You were left on your own. The Hungarians were left on their own, and maybe the Hungarians were under some delusion that somebody was going to come in and fight on their behalf, but that didn't happen. And the Czechoslovaks also couldn't really be under any illusion that anyone was going to come in and fight on their behalf. So it took 7 months from the moment that Dubček took over as leader of the Czechoslovak Communist Party, and the Soviet military intervention. And that really was a lesson that seems to have been lost on the sort of successive leaders, in particular Putin, that you've got to deal with these problems very quickly, and and quite ruthlessly. I mean, you can't let things fester. I think the Soviet leaders knew that they couldn't, allow this to go on for a couple of years. If they go on for a couple of years, then what will happen is that the Czechoslovakia will slip completely out of the control of Moscow. Um, so when the Soviets sent in their armed forces, it was obviously risky. It's always risky when you use force. But quite remarkably, Czechoslovakia did not resist, which itself says something about them, something about their national character, that they didn't resist any more than they resisted, incidentally, Hitler. It was one of the few states that didn't resist Hitler. Um, and after the invasion, well, I mean, Germany didn't really invade, but after the loss of Czechoslovakia in 38, 39, the Czechs blamed Neville Chamberlain unfairly, but then they blamed Neville Chamberlain for their predicament. Um, and but after '68, they really didn't have anyone to play. And in the West, of course, there was a lot of fist shaking and denunciations of the Soviet Union and in Britain. So this is August 21st, 1968. So everyone's out. Everyone's out of town in August. So the House of Commons, did something very unusual. They held a debate in August. The MPs, they're all out of town. They're enjoying their long, 6 weeks vacation. But they had a debate in Parliament, and was it 635? 630. Every single every single MP stood up and denounced the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, and that was that. I mean, and it came and went, and it was quickly forgotten about, and in no time at all, the Soviet leaders, the very same leaders who sent in the armed forces into Czechoslovakia, were feted and toasted and celebrated in the Western capitals. So it's August '68, May 1972. Richard Nixon visits Moscow. It was the first time a U.S. leader had visited Moscow. So it was a big summit. And then, of course, Brezhnev visits Washington in 1973. So if you use force quickly, ruthlessly, and you don't care about, let's see, you say, Marty always has a nice picture. And this picture, let me click on this picture. This is a picture of Nikita Khrushchev and Richard Nixon. I think this was at the time of Nixon's visit to Moscow, and when they had their kitchen debate, the famous kitchen debate. Um, and what was interesting about the kitchen debate was how, I mean, you really got a sense of just how effective a debater Nixon was. I mean, Nixon could easily have been intimidated by Khrushchev, they had a it was a very spirited debate. I think you can probably still get the debate on YouTube. Um, and but anyway, so that was the point about I was going to bring up about Czechoslovakia, that as well Hungary. So that the Soviet leaders um, dealt with problems very quickly, early, and effectively. And when that happens, however much people fume and rant and rave, the problems gradually go away, and then people forget about what you just did. The same thing happened in Hungary in '56, and so on. So the Russians have kind of forgot that lesson and have allowed things to fester. They fester and fester, and the longer they fester, the more problematic they become, and it becomes harder and harder to address, to lance the boil. And this is what the Soviet leaders knew in '68. That's why it took all of 7 months. Dubček elected leader of the party. January, August, the Soviets send in their armed forces. And what the Soviets also did, which was quite effective, is that after the invasion, they hauled Dubček to Moscow. They brought him to Moscow, harangued him, berated him, treated him, I think, very, very badly. Tortured him essentially. And then they sent him back to Prague and kept him on as leader for a few more months. So he was just became this kind of a Moscow's puppet for a few more months before they tossed him out, and then finally was even tossed out of the Communist Party. But they sort of they got their man. Didn't arrest him. didn't imprison him, didn't put him on trial, certainly didn't execute him. They decided they would keep him in place, towing the line, and then they can just push him out. Now, I guess at some point, historians will write about the the Russian special military operation, and I've always thought that the Russians had to have been thinking in terms of those of 56 and 68, how Russia can use force very quickly and simply overwhelm their opponents, and then install the whatever political puppet that they want in place, and then you can move on for that. But you have to do that, and you have to do that very quickly. You have to be able to do that, um, and have clearly people in mind who will exercise that sort of power. Now, in case of Hungary '56, they had János Kádár, a very shrewd customer, and survived really right through to the end of communism, through to about 1989. In the case of Czechoslovakia, they had their people in there. They who had long ties to Moscow, and so again, they could insert their people in place after Dubček had served out his purposes. They were able to push him out. Like there was a Vasil Bilak, and of course they had Gustav Husak, and then of course there was Svoboda, President Svoboda, with whom they had long-standing ties. So that's for anyone who still kind of wallows down memory lane, that was the time when the Russians knew how to use power effectively. Now, one other topic that I want to talk about is the Serbs. The Serbs. We kind of we forget about the Serbs. Well, not here at the Gaggle, but generally people forget about the Serbs. And somebody asked me, I think either during the last podcast or the one just before, whether I thought that a color revolution was taking place in Belgrade. And I said that there was a kind of a half color revolution. I thought that the Soroshites, who are completely embedded within Serbian society, they occupy every nook and cranny of Serbia and have done so ever since the overthrow of Milosevic. So I thought that they want to overthrow Vucic, but they haven't been given the go-ahead by Brussels and Washington. That they as far as Brussels and Washington are concerned, Vucic serves their purpose. He has this ostensibly nationalist credentials, which means that he can be pliable. You can always get him to kowtow to Brussels and Washington in the way that the sort of the so-called liberal opposition, they don't have that leeway. Because what they do is suspect. But Vucic, he has these credentials. He was in Milosevic's government. So I thought that basically the Soroshites jumped the gun. They decided to make their move against Vucic with these endless protests and attempts to provoke violence, but they haven't really been given the go ahead by Brussels and Washington. Now the and that's what I thought until I saw an editorial in the Financial Times the other day that made me think that perhaps a color revolution is now taking place. So let's take a look at this editorial in the Financial Times. So here we have um, the headline is "Time to Stop Indulging Serbia's Authoritarian President." So the moment I read this, and it's the Financial Times, the newspaper of the global elites, then I think, well, that sounds like um, the important people, not just the Sorosites, have decided to make their move in Serbia. And it says here, for 8 years as Serbia's president, and before that as prime minister, he has ruled with an increasingly interventionist hand, yet runs more of a managed democracy than a full blown autocracy. Vucic has performed a similarly wily balancing act on the global stage. So you notice how they're already acknowledging that he's very cunning. You can't, it's not that easy to get him. He has had cordial relations with Moscow without being so pally as to infuriate the EU and the US. He has turned a blind eye to the sale of Serbian arms to Ukraine. He has wooed Beijing for billions of dollars of investment in industry and infrastructure. And though Serbia is still only a candidate for EU membership, Vucic has close ties with the bloc's leaders, such as France President Emmanuel Macron and Ursula von der Leyen. So you see how the Financial Times is really kind of angry. He has close ties with Emmanuel Macron and Ursula von der Leyen. So it's like, in other words, it's an acknowledgement here that the Sorosites kind of jumped the gun. Not least via holding out the prospect that European mining companies could exploit the country's untapped lithium deposits to supercharge Europe's quest for greater energy independence. He has also forged good relations with close aides of Donald Trump in the US president's first term. Vucic could still, in theory, remove curbs on the non state media, open up the political terrain for the opposition, and launch genuinely independent probes into scandals such as the Novi Sad station collapse. This is the thing that they've been berating him now since last November, even though nothing that happened really has anything to do with him. I mean, it's clearly shoddy workmanship, and may well be corruption, but it had nothing to do with the Serbian president. And they've already published a lot of material about it. People have been imprisoned, and still no one is satisfied, as if somehow, nothing short of Vucic's exit will atone for this accident at the Novi Sad station, and so on. And it says the EU and Britain have indulged in for too long. Realpolitik has reflected the desire not to see Serbia slip into Russia's orbit. But this hands-off approach is no longer tenable. Vucic has to be pushed to be more accountable. The Financial Times, he has to be pushed. We have to push him and hold genuinely fair elections. I mean, I love this. Whenever they say genuinely fair elections, it means unfair elections. It means no elections at all. It means elections that are so rigged as to ensure that our guys manage to win, like as in Romania. Vucic has won all his elections very comfortably. There's genuine, so that they weren't really fair election, genuinely fair election. This is anyway essential for any hope of EU membership. The alternative is that Serbia will slide down the path that Georgia has regrettably taken. So they've lost Georgia, becoming a phony democracy over which the EU has no influence and about whose successes it can do no more than issue statements of protest. So when you read this, then you realize that, well, obviously, now they're obviously, and they want to get Vucic. They see that prize is theirs, and they're going to bring up, oh, the unfair elections, the corruption, oh, he's too pro-Moscow, and so on. And so this could be the harbinger of a color revolution. I still have my doubts because I don't think uh, Trump is going to be much interested in toppling Vucic. Because I think Vucic played along with Trump during his first term. You remember when he, with the whole thing that he's going to have good economic, or at least the economic relations with Kosovo, and then he promised to move the Serbian embassy to Jerusalem, which Serbia hasn't done. And of course, Trump is touting this great peace that uh, he has affected between Serbia and Kosovo. So it wouldn't really be in his interest to turn against Vucic. So, I mean, I think they're trying to persuade the EU to turn against him, but I think the EU kind of think that he's quite useful to them. If Vucic went and he was replaced by one of those creatures, you remember who ruled Serbia immediately after Milosevic, those people like Boris Tadic and Vuk Jeremic, and these total non-entities, but they wouldn't be able to get anything done. They'd be so unpopular that they wouldn't be able to just get any of the things that EU wants. After all, Serbia is providing arms to Ukraine. Serbia has voted against Russia at the United Nations, so they're getting all that out of Vucic. It will be hard for them to get it out of the any if they try to replace them with those liberals. And they still obviously hope that somehow they can persuade Vucic to recognize or de facto recognize Kosovo independence. That would be a big success for them. That can only happen if there's somebody like Vucic, a kind of a nationalist in Belgrade. Get one of those creatures, those so-called liberals in there, and that you can forget about that. However, that's a little different from when it comes to the Republika Srpska. We talked a little bit about the case of Milorad Dodik. Remember that that after Dayton, they kind of created this office of the High Representative, who was simply an appointment by the international community. He was only supposed to be there for about a year or so, and then just to oversee the implementation of Dayton. But not only is he still there 30 years on, but his powers have grown immeasurably. He now has powers that that far surpasses anything that was conceived in the Dayton Accords. And how that was done was through this thing that was invented. The thing you have to remember always about the West is that it walks back any agreements it signs onto immediately. So the first thing that they did after they signed the Dayton Accords in the fall of 1995 was to set up a mechanism, an institutional mechanism, to ignore Dayton. And so they did it with something called the Peace Implementation Council. It has no international standing, but this was obviously the Western powers. They got together, created this Peace Implementation Council as if they would be in charge of implementing Dayton. Dayton is there. It's you can look it up. It's on the internet exactly what's in Dayton. They decide, well, we'll just ignore that and we'll just simply implement Dayton in the way that we think Dayton should be implemented. So they created this Peace Implementation Council. The usual cast of characters: Germany, the United States, the United Kingdom, France. Russia was also on the Peace Implementation Council, but Russia was obviously in a minority. Um, and um, so Ahmadovich now says, Dodik announced plans to hold a referendum. What does this mean? We're coming to that. That's where I'm teeing all this up. So they set up this Peace Implementation Council. And then what did the Peace Implementation Council do? Well, they created something called the Bomb Powers. Now, the Bomb Powers was that they gave them to this office of the High Representative. So this was the representative of the international community who had no democratic credentials whatsoever. He wasn't elected to anything. He had no real connections at all with Bosnia and Herzegovina. He came from some other country. We had that drunken idiot from the UK, Paddy Ashdown. He was, he had the position of High Representative. Wolfgang Petritsch, who, one of these absolute creeps from Austria. It's all, as I said, I think it's always either an Austrian or a German who holds that position. And then you had Carlos Westendorp. And so all this time, this office of the High Representative acquired more and more and more powers, to the point where this unelected bureaucrat could simply annul legislation at whim. He could fire elected leaders at whim if he thought, well, this leader isn't really facilitating the implementation of Dayton. You're fired. This was done, of course, in 1998, just after the institutionalization of the Bonn powers. They fired the president of the Republika Srpska, and they replaced him with Milorad Dodik, who at the time was thought to be liberal, or like he was the one who was kind of pro-Western, ready to play ball with the West. The name was Poplashen. He was the president of the Republika Srpska. He was fired by Carlos Westendorp and replaced by Nikolic. But as they continued in this way, then there's going to be a crisis was going to develop. And the crisis developed because the new High Representative, Christian Schmidt, went beyond just firing people. If you fire people, I mean, that in itself is outrageous, that any unelected High Representative fires elected leaders. I mean, imagine, we talk about monarchs. We don't like, monarchs. But at least monarchs don't fire elected leaders. So he did that. He all of them went around firing, but Schmidt did something very interesting. Because his predecessor, who was an Austrian, I've forgotten his name. He was an Austrian. Had changed the criminal code in Bosnia and Herzegovina, making it a criminal offense to deny genocide, making it a criminal offense to celebrate war criminals. So he basically, off his own bat, this unelected leader from Austria, just changed the criminal code in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now Schmidt went ahead and made it a criminal offense. He also changed the criminal code. He made it a criminal offense to ignore his diktats. So so in other words, he can basically dictate anything that he wants, anytime he wants. But he also then went ahead, changed the criminal code to make it a criminal offense to ignore his dictates. Now, the Republika Srpska obviously wasn't going to take this lying down, and so their parliament said, well, they just annulled this. They just said that this change in the criminal code is null and void. We're not going to accept the principle that you can be sent to prison for disobeying the orders of an unelected bureaucrat. So they did that, and Milorad Dodik, I mean, obviously he's the president, signed it into law, and lo and behold, well, hey, that's a crime. You've now made it a crime. Having made it a crime to ignore the diktats of the Office of the High Representative, adopting legislation to ignore the diktats of the High Representative is a crime. And then Dodik was prosecuted, and with these ridiculous courts, and naturally he was found guilty, and step by step, that he's been found guilty on appeal. Basically the appeal went affirmed the conviction. I mean, he was sentenced to prison, but in the Republika Srpska, you can basically avoid prison if you agree to pay some fine, which he's done. He's paid the fine. But he's basically now been stripped of his position as the president of the Republika Srpska. He's no longer president because he had the temerity to defy the office of the High Representative. Now, all of this goes completely ridiculously covered in the media, where it says, "Well, this is the rule of law. The office of the High Representative embodies the rule of law, and Dodik is challenging the rule of law." That's not the rule of law. How can you have a rule of law when an unelected bureaucrat can change the criminal code, and particularly change the criminal code in such a way as to say it is a crime to disobey me? You're complete. You're like an absolute monarch. The 17th century. Absolute monarch. It's a crime to disobey me. And then when you pass legislation saying, well, I'm sorry, but this is not going to fly, then he says, right, well, that's it. You have disobeyed me, and therefore you need to be prosecuted. And Dodik, the president, was prosecuted, convicted, and now he's been stripped of his office of president. Now, this really makes things a little difficult for him. And let me just show you. He's been sending out tweets and as to what he's planning to do. And he is indeed threatening to. Where are we? That's all right. Let me. He is indeed threatening to hold a referendum, and particularly a referendum on the secession of the Republika Srpska from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, this, of course, should be the sovereign right of any nation to hold a referendum and to decide its own destiny. However, NATO, of course, is not having any of it, and is threatening him. So let's take a look at what he's been tweeting out. And here, Dodik says they did not respect the constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina. They did not respect the constitution of Republika Srpska. They did not respect the law, and I'm supposed to respect their disrespect for everything. I will not respect it. I will respect the will of the Serbian people. You are arrogant and haughty, yet you expect me to be submissive. I will not be. I am the president of the Republika Srpska, and you can write whatever you want. The people elected me. A foreign government will not remove me. You go your way, we will go ours. I hope our paths paths do not cross. And then he goes, the Republika Srpska does not seek conflict, but respect and freedom, which will be achieved through a referendum. This is our message. Return us to the Dayton Peace Agreement. We will express our opinion at the referendum, which will be held at the end of September. Even after 30 years since the signing, of the Dayton Peace Agreement, there are still those who want to undermine Srpska. Today, an important segment of the Republic of Srpska has been destroyed, and it was destroyed because the other Muslim side, through an abuse of the unconstitutional Bosnia-Herzegovina court, the prosecutor's office, as well as through pressures and subservience of some of our people, has reached a position to eliminate the stance of the Republika Srpska with a quasi-judicial decision. This nullifies the entire Dayton Peace Agreement without the possibility of its reaffirmation. Therefore, we must reject Schmidt, who is Christian Schmidt, who is the Office of the High Representative, who is the greatest deception, and the PIC, the Peace Implementation Council. These were ad hoc groups. The so-called High Representative is the greatest deception, and he has destroyed Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then here, Dodik goes on, the Serbian people are encouraged by the return of common sense politics and peace initiatives under the leadership of President Trump, and in particular by the commitment of his administration to confronting the lawfare targeting the free expression of the people's democratic will. No one understands our predicament better than President Trump, that, as he said, when the radical left can't win via democratic vote, they abuse the legal system to jail their opponents. This is their standard playbook throughout the world. He prevailed, and so shall I. I will not be intimidated by threats of prison to remove me from office. It was in Schmidt's Germany, perhaps directed to Schmidt prophetically, that Vice President Vance recognized with moral clarity, when we see European courts canceling elections and senior officials threatening to cancel others, we ought to ask whether we're holding ourselves to an appropriately high standard. We do not stand alone against the likes of dictators like Schmidt. I shall stand firm. We stand firm with our global partners who champion democracy. What we are witnessing now is a continuation of the Obama-Biden-Schmidt sanctions against Republika Srpska, because we stand with the Trump administration against mass migration, against the Iranian regime's axis with Sarajevo, and the free and proud expression of our national heritage, which the Dayton Accord guarantees. They did not defeat us with sanctions, and they will not defeat us with lawfare. All right, now there's a lot there to mull over. The problem, first of all, for Dodik is that he's been threatening this referendum for a long time. And I think we talked about this, I think, some years ago, that he keeps threatening and then he never really goes through with his threats. So he's now left a little bit late because he's not president anymore. So even if he were now to organize a referendum, it would be hard to make the case that it has any real validity because he's now a private citizen. So, in theory, he could, out of his own pocket, organize a referendum, but it won't have any kind of validity. He's not president anymore. This is something he should have done a long time ago. He should have had that referendum. It would have been overwhelmingly in favor of secession from Bosnia and Herzegovina. A referendum is absolutely within the prerogatives of any nation, which is that it has national self-determination. The Serbs were forced into the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. They didn't want to do it. It was forced upon them. They want to be with their fellow Serbs. They want to form a common state with their fellow Serbs. Once their desire to maintain their common state, which was Yugoslavia, once that was liquidated by the West, these same Western powers, Germany, France, the UK, the United States. They were the ones who destroyed Yugoslavia. So once they had ignored the desire of the Serbs to remain in their common state, which was Yugoslavia, then the next thing that they did is that they denied the right of the Serbs to have a state of their own, so that all Serbs would be in one state. So no, no, no. The Serbs have to be all broken up. You've got to have some Serbs that have got to stay in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Some Serbs have to stay in Croatia. But you absolutely cannot have a state of your own. And so they were forced into this state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. There was never really any reason for it other than Bosnia and Herzegovina, particularly the Muslim leaders of Bosnia and Herzegovina, namely Alija Izetbegovic, became an American client. He became an American client in the early 1990s, and Americans promoted his aspirations for a unitary state of the Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, the Dodik could have had that referendum, even if he didn't move towards a secession. He could have still had the referendum and said, hey, I've got here, the people have voted. 90, probably more than 95% of the Serbs of Republika Srpska would have said, yeah, we want to secede. We want to be with our fellow Serbs in Serbia. Because then he would have had that in his pocket. Now he doesn't have it. The other problem for him is that he's saying that the Serbs of Republika Srpska must boycott this election. Now, election is going to be forced upon them because there isn't a president anymore. He's been stripped of the office of the presidency, so Republika Srpska doesn't have a president. So there is going to be an election in the Republika Srpska to replace Dodik. So what happens then? Okay, Dodik says, okay, all Serbs must, refuse to take part in this election. They must absolutely boycott the election, take no part in the election. And chances are, maybe 75, 80% of the Serbs in the Republika Srpska will boycott this election. But 20% will vote. And as far as the West is concerned, that's enough. That's good enough for them. They've got the 20%, even 15%. They'll say, that's it, fine, we've got it. We had an election, 15% showed up to vote, but we accept that result. And so what happens then is that there'll be a new president of the Republika Srpska, voted by 7 or 8% of the Serbs of the Republika Srpska, and he will be a complete Western creature. Total, absolute, mouthpiece of the Western powers. And what is he going to do with this mandate of whatever 7 or 8% of the vote? What's he going to do? He's going to liquidate Dayton. He will liquidate the independence of the Republika Srpska. He will then, facilitate the centralization of Bosnia and Herzegovina and therefore make a move towards joining NATO, which is what the West has been seeking since Dayton, to get Bosnia and Herzegovina into NATO. He might even move towards recognizing Kosovo. So Dodik has now been banned from holding public office for 6 years. Okay, 6 years' time, sure, he'll still be a relatively young man. But by then, there probably won't be a Republika Srpska anymore. So this is really where the problem arises, that you've got, having failed to make his move against the Western powers, back I think when he should have done, his options now are quite limited. Now, what I don't know is whether if this puppet, this creature who will win with 7% of the vote and declare himself to be the president of Republika Srpska, and do everything that NATO wants from him. What I don't know is what kind of a reaction that will provoke within Serbia, and obviously in the Republika Srpska. After all, they did fight a war back in the 90s. Now they're probably rather chastened now, but will they accept something so flagrantly undemocratic as a leader without any kind of a mandate imposed on them? We'll have to see. Um, but that's a kind of a major step. They've got Dodik out. Dodik, who was exercising the democratic his prerogatives as the elected leader, has been, and he's been the elected leader of the Serbs really since the late 90s, almost 30 years. He has now been thrown out by unelected figures such as this Christian Schmidt. And knowing NATO, knowing how they operate, this is their opportunity. They're not going to let go of this opportunity. They've got Dodik out. The Serbs will absolutely, they'll boycott this election. They'll say, well, Dodik is our leader. We're not going to take part in this election. They'll boycott the election, and somebody's going to get in. And this is the stunt that they pulled in Romania. This is the stunt they pulled in Moldova. They always pull this stunt. And there will be a leader. And once they have that, once you have that, this is your historic opportunity to liquidate the Republika Srpska. That mistake that they feel that they made by acknowledging the rights of the Serbs at Dayton. Clinton wanted to wrap up the war, and then so they feel all these years the West has felt that they made a mistake in giving anything to the Serbs at Dayton. And now I think they have the opportunity to liquidate Dayton altogether. All right, let's take a look at some of our what the Gagglers are saying. Before we talk about some other things, but let's take a look at our locals page, where the members of our community, express their ideas, and of course make sure that the dogs are kept, in the life that they're accustomed. So Robert says, has Lavrov explained whether his SSSR shirt is new or dates back to the USSR? That's a very good question. I haven't. He's been asked a few questions about that, and he's just he hasn't. At least so far as I've seen, he hasn't quite explained why he was wearing that. I don't know whether that's a very good question, whether it does date to the USSR or whether it's just one of these things that it's kind of Soviet kitsch, where you can just buy your buy sweatshirts with Stalin on it, on the sweatshirt, or Lenin or whatever. So I don't know, and I'm not exactly sure what he was conveying. I mean, I think it's possible that he was trying to impart the message that the USSR always prevails in the end. That somehow what we did to the Germans, what we did to everyone else, the USSR prevails in the end. I mean, I don't find it particularly convincing, because even if they did prevail in the Great Patriotic War, they didn't prevail against the West. I mean, they did collapse, and why they did so is obviously it's a complicated question, but nonetheless, they threw it away, and that has to be part of the legacy of the USSR, which is just like a lot of things are the legacy of the USSR. The terror, the collectivization, the fantastic victory in World War II, the space program. Being the first power to put a man in space. That's part of the Soviet legacy. But another part of the Soviet legacy is that they just tossed it away. They tossed away all of the that great state that they had created. Became one of the two superpowers, and Russia had always been one of the great powers of the world, but one among several. It was never, it was Russia, France, Great Britain, um, and then Germany after 1871, but before that Prussia, so Prussia, Austria. These were all great powers, and Russia was one of them. After 1945, the Soviet Union became one of only two superpowers. That was something. The Russians had never enjoyed that kind of power. So that was tossed away, and I think Russians, I think, are a little still smarting about that. I think they're not very happy about that, um, and obviously they'd like to get some of that back, but it's very difficult. Those kinds of things, they happen once in I don't know how many hundreds of years. They don't. It's not going to come back tomorrow. So, um, but yeah, I mean, it's the same. The Soviet leaders. It was the same Soviet Communist Party that did all those things that we just talked about: the terror, the collectivization, the space program. It's also that same Communist Party that tossed away a great state, tossed away a kind of a super state, and for no obviously discernible reason. So I don't fully know why he did it, what he was trying to convey uh, by wearing that. Maybe it's just nostalgic um, about it. Um, but anyway, Ivan Grozny says, to be funny, I'm curious what you think of the Nick Fuentes Tucker Candace drama. Well, I find all of those people, with the exception of Tucker, really very. Um, I just don't take them very seriously. I have to think that Nick Fuentes is quite a shady character. I mean, I listened to Glenn Greenwald talk about him, and it's not always very serious. He was obviously very talented. He believes certain things and so on. But to me, it's so extreme and so unlikely to generate um, any kind of serious support. I mean, I'm sure, yeah, he has his followers on the internet, but that doesn't mean a great deal. You absolutely, you can rant and rave about whatever, that you're a great admirer of Hitler, and you'll have a big following. You will have a following, and any kind of nonsense, and you will have a following. Um, but the question then is, what purpose does Fuentes serve? Is Fuentes really in the business of discrediting figures on the right precisely by Fuentes associating himself with, obviously, anti-Semitism and with uh, pro-fascist sympathies? So then you kind of wonder, why would somebody do that? Why are you going talking like this, other than that you're trying to discredit the figures on the right? There are other people like that, like this guy Jackson Hinkle, very young guy, as is Fuentes, very young, obviously also talented, um, but just so crazy that his pronouncements, that you think, well, what purpose is he really serving? Well, who to for what end is he making all these ridiculous declarations, which others are obviously making a record of, and will doubtless make use of when the time comes. So I just feel very suspicious of that. Now, to Candace Owens is so similar like that. I mean, I just think also find her very difficult to take seriously. I don't find her case against the Macrons, particularly compelling. Um, and I think that she is in the business of clicks. I mean, I think she is in the business of making an awful lot of money on the internet. She knows how to generate attention. She's knows exactly how to make a lot of money. Now, I can't say I've followed this lawsuit that the Macrons have filed against her um, closely, but I do think, from what I've read, I mean, so I may be wrong about that, but from what I've read, I think that the Macrons have a strong case against her. I think they'll have a case against her, saying that she did smear and slander the Macrons without really doing the responsible due diligence. They provided her with information that she didn't really make use of that information. Um, the First Amendment doesn't really protect you from defamation. I mean, if you're defaming someone and they can show you had malicious intent, um, then you'll win. Um, Tucker Carlson. I like Tucker Carlson. I think, but the problem with the interviews that he does um, these days. I mean, I don't want to get into the whole thing between Tucker and Fuentes, and then Fuentes and Candace, because that's just I just don't think that's all that interesting. But I do feel that Tucker really does need to push back much more against the people he interviews. I mean, he has some, undoubtedly interesting guests on that show, but he hasn't really pushed back enough against them, and a lot of them spout, I don't know, things that are clearly nonsensical, and if you don't push back again, so he had this guy on, I forgot, this professor at Cornell, who's a professor of organic chemistry, but seems to be pontificating on just about every topic under the sun, and he said at one point, I mean, he was talking all sorts of things about the Las Vegas, the Vegas killer, and so on. But then he started talking about World War II, and essentially then he threw out the thing about, well, maybe we should have been on Hitler's side against Stalin. Um, Now, if you want to make that argument, I mean, and people have, of course, made that argument in the past, then you have to at least present some arguments in favor of it. And if you're Tucker, you need to at least, you know, address that argument. Would that have been a better option for the United States or for the West to side with Hitler against Stalin? He didn't really do that. But when you let that go, then all those slimy rats, disgusting rats like Mark Levin, will pounce. Oh, Tucker Carlson, wanted to side with Hitler in World War II. Now, Tucker didn't say that, but by not, you know, uh, forcing this guy to explain himself, you open yourself up to that smear. And so that's why that's not a good thing for him to be. He's an influential. He's an influential figure. He's a serious. He's regarded as a kind of a serious political, cultural, intellectual figure, and you don't want to get yourself um, smeared as someone who advocated taking Hitler's side in World War II. And I think that I just think that if Tucker's going to do these interviews with controversial figures, he really has to be much more willing um, to challenge things that are not only contentious but which could easily come back to haunt him. So, yeah, those are my thoughts. I'll probably have some more thoughts later. But anyway, thank you so much, Ivan Grozny. And then Robert says Bolivian President Luis Arce even argues that the war on drug, in fact, functions primarily as cover for U.S. attempts to control South America. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true. I mean, without question that the Americans have. And I think, as you know, I'm no fan of drugs, and you know, I think they are very harmful. I think they are very dangerous to people's health. There's all sorts of costs involved and so on. But without getting into that right now, I think that is true. That the drug war allows the United States the right to intervene in other countries' internal affairs. And of course, the United States has been hypocritical. As we all know, this has been very hypocritical in the drug war because we also know the United States has been in the business of importing drugs into the United States. We know that the CIA was involved in importing cocaine into the United States. It was a way of funding the Contras during the wars of the 1980s, and so that basically CIA kind of they more or less admitted that they did that, and that happened also in the war in Laos. That was also the CIA was funding that war in Laos through the sale of narcotics. So the war on drugs has always been hypocritical by the Americans. And so absolutely they've been using that. They did that in Afghanistan as well. The Americans were involved in the drug trade in Afghanistan. So remember that the Taliban had ended opium growth, and basically the Americans revived the opium trade. This it's wholly implausible that the Americans are actually really serious about the drug war. Um, Anyway, Summer Petros, welcome. Good to see you. And then Dan Rock says, George, do you think that Ukraine will split the EU after its defeat? I feel there are two very separate camps. Slovakia and Hungary are vocal, but I believe there are some others who silently share their opinions. I don't know. It's very hard to say because I think that the EU has been quite successful at coercing um, and pushing everybody into that EU consensus. It's yeah, you're absolutely right about Hungary and Slovakia, but Hungary and Slovakia, in the first place, are both small countries. Hungary, population of 10 million. Slovakia population, I think 4.5 million. So that already is a very small population. So compared to the size of the EU, it's not very consequential. There's also the issue of whether Viktor Orban will survive politically. I mean, there's an election coming up next April. He's underwater in the polls. I mean, there's still time to recover, but he is underwater. He's been in power now for 15 years. That's a long time. People get tired of any leader who's been around for 15 years. So he might lose. And there's no question that if he does lose, that the new government will absolutely follow the EU line on Ukraine. I mean, there's no question about that. And then Slovakia would then be isolated. So um, I tend to think that if the worst comes to the worst for the EU and NATO, let's say Ukraine is defeated. Now, admittedly, we don't yet know exactly what form that defeat will take, but I would imagine the most likely scenario wouldn't be a collapse in Kiev, but basically a collapse on the military front. So there'll be a collapse in the Donbass, and then maybe a collapse in Kherson and Zaporozhye. So let's say Russia incorporates these four oblasts along with Crimea into the Russian Federation. I think to move westwards for the Russians would be a very difficult task. I mean, it's a huge undertaking, and I don't think Russia really has the manpower to be able to do that. I mean, it requires huge armies to move westwards. Take Kiev, take Odessa, even take Kharkov. That's a tall order. I mean, unless Russia decides to order a general mobilization, and I don't think Russia wants to do that, then I don't think that's going to happen. So the most likely scenario is that Russia takes the oblasts. Now, how does NATO respond to that? Well, the NATO will respond by essentially coercing everybody to fall into line. They'll say Russia is a huge threat to all of us. Russia needs to be dealt with. Russia is a great danger. We must fight Russia everywhere. We must, whatever threat the Soviet Union was, Russia is 10 times greater. And this is what Macron said the other day in his interview, that Russia is an ogre. It's a cannibal, and we have to, everyone in Europe has to mobilize against Russia. So I think that will be the response. So therefore, I think even if Orban survives and Fico survives, I think there will be just lonely voices in the wilderness. I think that the consensus in Europe will be, yeah, we need to clamp down on dissent. We need to impose our coercive measures. We have to bring the internet under control. We need to bring all our institutions under control in order to fight Russia. And I think that's what I think the European governments want to do. I don't think the Alternative for Deutschland or Marie Le Pen will have much of an impact on all of this. I think they will fall into line. And particularly Marine Le Pen, I don't think she'll resist particularly, even if she is allowed to run in 2027. I think she'll fall in with these demands, but she'll be another Maloney. And as for the Alternative for Deutschland, if they become too irksome, I think they're just going to be outlawed. They'll be outlawed as anti-democratic and pro-Putin. So I actually do think that Europe will kind of mobilize intellectually, culturally, spiritually for this twilight struggle against Russia, and I think dissent will be crushed, and that's really what Europe's leaders want. I mean, I think that they look back nostalgically to the great days of COVID, and think about what they managed to do. Um, how they managed to coerce the publics, and I think that's what they're going to do now. So I just don't see that there's going to be the splits in the EU, and this has been, a lot of people have been predicting these splits in the EU really pretty much since the beginning, and so we're 3.5 years on, and it's still Orban and Fitzo. For Fitzo, he joined a little later, but basically it's Orban and Fitzo, and everyone else just follows suit. Even though there may be this or that politician may speak out and say this is, hey, this is not a great idea. Hating Putin is not a policy, whatever. But ultimately, it's the EU have managed anti-democratic practices. They brought this to a perfect T, and I don't think anything is going to stop it. I think a victory for Russia in the Donbass will be an absolute shot in the arm for the anti-democratic institutions of the EU. Robert, thank you very much, Robert, for your generosity. And Robert says, I asked ChatGPT about Ukrainian independence, which said that the USSR did not grant it, and that the Russian Federation recognized it in 1991 without conditions. Conditions for neutrality and no NATO only came later. Is that right? Well, it's not really right. I mean, the Ukraine issued its declaration on state sovereignty in 1990. So that was its claim. That was the declaration of state sovereignty. I think Yeltsin, as the president of Russia, Yeltsin recognized that. They said this was the recognition of Ukraine's declaration of state sovereignty. So that I think the parliament in the Russian Federation recognized this declaration of state sovereignty. Now, the Declaration of State Sovereignty says neutrality, no joining of any military alliances, and no nuclear weapons. So the dissolution of the USSR, which took place at the Belovezh in December 1991, was based on this the declarations of state sovereignty, since Russia had recognized the Declaration of State Sovereignty. So on that basis, it recognized the independence of Ukraine. So yeah. I mean, there wasn't anything like the seceded from anything. I mean, the the point was that there's two different things here. I mean, which is the recognition of the Declaration of State Sovereignty, which was done by the due political institutions of the Russian Federation, and then you have the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. Now, the dissolution of the USSR is wholly without any legal basis whatsoever. I mean, so that it doesn't really mean anything to say, well, it came without any preconditions or whatever. I mean, it was just a completely illegal act. I mean, you can't, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus didn't have the right simply to take it upon themselves to dissolve the USSR. So that whole thing was just illegal and unconstitutional. It's not based on any law at all. So the only legal instrument, I would say, was the Declaration of State Sovereignty, which was issued by the Ukrainian, the Verkhovna Rada, and that it was acknowledged and respected by the Russian Parliament. So those at least have a legal basis for it. And that Declaration of State Sovereignty is explicit about about neutrality. But the dissolution, I mean, the dissolution of the USSR is just nothing. I mean, I mean, Russia didn't have any basis. I mean, you did have, in principle, according to the constitution of the USSR, the right, republics had the right to secede. But Ukraine didn't exercise that right, nor did Russia exercise that right, because in any case, even if you exercise that right, you kind of have to figure out the modalities of how you're actually going to do it. What would be a secession? What would need to be? What steps would you have to go through in order to achieve a legal secession? I mean, do you have to hold a referendum? Do you have to negotiate something with somebody else? Do you have to get the constitution of the USSR has to be changed or whatever? I mean, you have to figure out, which the Soviet Union never did, because it was unthinkable that anybody would secede. So even though there was a recognition of the right to secession, but there was never any description of what steps republics would have to take in order to achieve a legal secession. Certainly, what happened at Belovezh was not secession. They just simply dissolved the USSR. Well, no republic at all has the right to dissolve the USSR. So that had no legal basis. So that's why, as I say, I think the only steps that had a legal basis was the Declaration of State Sovereignty in 1990. But anyway, thank you so much, Robert. That's really, that's really interesting. Anyway, and then Dan Rock says, ChatGPT will also tell you that Israel has a right to exist, but Palestine isn't as clear. I wish ChatGPT would disappear. What I find with ChatGPT is you have to ask you want, if you want a particular answer, then ask the question that is likely to elicit the answer you want. So if for instance, you want to have, say, I want ChatGPT to say Palestine has a right to exist, then what I would do is say the Oslo Accords declared that there will be two states, in what was the historically mandated territory of Palestine, and Israel next to a Palestinian state. The Palestinian state would comprise the West Bank and Gaza. Doesn't that suggest that the international community has accepted the right of the Palestinian state to exist? Now, if you put it in that way, I will bet you the ChatGPT who says you're absolutely right. The international community has accepted that the Palestinian state has a right to exist. But if you just ask, does Palestine have a right to exist? And so, no, absolutely not. So it's just a matter of how you're going to frame the question, and then ChatGPT will give you the answer that you're looking for. And then Danro goes on. I guess in 1991, Ukraine not being in NATO wasn't a question, as NATO hadn't got past Germany. Well, that's a very good question, but we're talking about the Declaration of State Sovereignty took place in 1990, and you're absolutely right that in 1990 the Soviet Union was still in existence, so Ukraine was still a sovereign republic of the USSR. So the Declaration of State Sovereignty wasn't really a declaration of independence. It was just said, well, we're sovereign. It might be that in effect, it's independence because a state of sovereignty means, if it means anything, is that state laws supersede federal laws. So, in other words, in this case, would be the Soviet Republic of Ukraine. The laws of the Soviet Republic of Ukraine supersede the laws of the USSR. Um, and I mean, obviously, Yeltsin should never have accepted that, but nonetheless, um, that was when they were issuing these ridiculous. If you remember, 1990 and 1991, all of the republics were issuing these idiotic um, declarations of state sovereignty, which of course was making nonsense of the USSR. I mean, you might say, yeah, we're still a member of the USSR, but the Republican laws supersede federal laws, which means that you're not really a member of the Federation anymore. But going back to the question of NATO, I mean, but it was obvious in terms of uh, where this was heading, and they February 1990. Um, Baker already promises Gorbachev that NATO will not move 1 inch to the east. So already in 1990, there is considerable anxiety as to, well, if the USSR does dissolve, would would these republics join NATO? And just as I was saying earlier about Czechoslovakia, that was a very big issue in 1968. And the Soviet leaders, who were debating among themselves as to what to do about Czechoslovakia, it was absolutely front and center of their thinking that if things get out of hand in Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovakia will leave the Warsaw Pact and join NATO. So I think that you're right to say, well, NATO hadn't gone past Germany. At that stage, no. But anyone with any sense of history would know that that's going to become an issue. NATO is always around, and so that therefore the declaration. I mean, it's kind of odd in any case to say this was again 1990 while the Soviet Union is still in existence. So I don't know what it means to be neutral if you're still a member of the Soviet Union. I mean, you're in the Soviet Union, you're in the Warsaw Pact. So I don't know exactly what that meant, neutrality. But either way, that declaration did preclude joining joining military alliances, or certainly joining the NATO military alliance. Um, So anyway, Marty, yeah, there's the picture of Khrushchev. Yeah. Anyway, Cynthia, always very good to see you, Cynthia. Um, and thank you very much, as always, Cynthia, for your generosity. So Cynthia says, as you may recall, George, U.S. General Donahue proposed that since Kaliningrad Oblast is surrounded by NATO on all sides, yeah, NATO forces could easily seize this Russian exclave on the Baltic Sea, which I know is very foolhardy, as it can easily cause the war to expand into Europe. But don't you think that Kaliningrad may indeed be a prime target for a land swap that Trump seems obsessed with, especially given how obsessed he is with the idea of owning waterfront property, be it Gaza or Crimea? Huh. That's a very interesting notion. I hadn't thought of that. Um, well, you're right. I mean, I can imagine if somebody were to put that proposal to Trump. Hey, this would be very neat. Getting Kaliningrad, and then he might then turn around to the Russians and say, look, I mean, you look at the Baltic Sea. I mean, you've basically been pushed out. Um, Norway, Sweden, Finland, they're all in NATO. Denmark, NATO. Poland, NATO. Germany, NATO. And when you come out of the Baltic Sea, then you've got the United Kingdom, NATO. So you basically don't really have any good options there. So why don't you just hand Kaliningrad over to us? I don't think that will fly. I don't think the Russians will accept that, because Russia still has to defend St. Petersburg. I mean, St. Petersburg used to be the capital of the Russian Empire, and now it's extremely vulnerable. I mean, it's really has NATO all around it. So, and therefore NATO is really just within a few miles of St. Petersburg. And so, if you're thinking about how do you defend St. Petersburg, then you want to have your military base in Kaliningrad. Though, I mean, as you say, in any war, it would be very easy for NATO to seize Kaliningrad. I mean, there was just no, it wouldn't be any problem. But at the moment, it's still it's a powerful base. And therefore it can be of use to the Russians to defend St. Petersburg. But yeah, I mean, if there were a war, it wouldn't be at all difficult for NATO to seize it. But the question then is, if Trump were to say, well, give us Kaliningrad, what would Trump offer in exchange? What would he give the Russians in exchange? And I don't quite see that he has anything very much that that the Russians would be interested in. Kaliningrad's really their access to the one access is to the Baltics. Without it, it becomes a very, very problematic for them. And I think that really does need to be realized. I mean, when you get all these people on the internet, the sort of rah rah Russia, Russia's winning, Russia's triumphant. Just look at that map. I mean, just look at everything that's happened there. I mean, just where was the Soviet Union? It had its satellites states. You had the Baltic states. Then you had Finland, which was neutral. Sweden, ostensibly neutral. That gave the Soviet Union real strength in the Baltics, which doesn't have anymore. I mean, what's happened in the Baltics has definitely shifted the balance of power against Russia. That's why Kaliningrad is really its last outpost there. So, but anyway, certainly it's very, very, very interesting point. Anne-Marie, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to see you. And Anne-Marie, thank you so much for your really fascinating observations about Night on Bald Mountain. As you know, last week in the Gaggle Music Club, we had Night on Bald Mountain, and I posted the original version, the one that Mussorgsky himself wrote, which he basically didn't publish in his lifetime because people were telling him that it's too rough, it's too too lacking in any kind of polish. And so, but after his death, he died rather young. Rimsky-Korsakov orchestrated it, but removed some of the rougher edges, and it's the Rimsky-Korsakov version of Night on Bald Mountain that audiences are familiar with, or it become a kind of part of the orchestral repertoire. But then, at some point in the 20th century, orchestra started performing the original, the Mussorgsky's original, even though I think people still prefer the Rimsky-Korsakov version. Anyway, I posted the original, and then Anne Marie, um, offered I think some very really interesting and critical observations, comparing the original with the Rimsky-Korsakov version, and then Anne Marie posted the Rimsky-Korsakov version. So it's there on the locals page. Please go to that, the Gaggle Music Club, Night on Bald Mountain, and then you can listen to the Mussorgsky version, and then listen to the Rimsky-Korsakov version, and then see which one you like. And then Anne Marie, I think, said very insightfully that the ending of the Rimsky-Korsakov version is I think is superior to the ending in the Mussorgsky version. So, but there's room for disagreement there. But I think it's really interesting, and thank you so much, Anne Marie, for that. Very, very interesting, stimulating, and insightful commentary. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And then Psinok says, George, thanks for your analysis. Always learn something. Well, thank you very much. I think Putin made a huge miscalculation by not taking care of the SMO in a decisive manner. Did you see Trump's Truth Social today basically saying Ukraine? Yeah, let me do that. Let me just show what Trump did today. That's very interesting. So let me just find this. Because I wanted to show this, which was I thought a very strange thing for him to send out, because many of us were saying, things, that was things that were complimentary. I mean, next to the hapless Europeans, it's easy to be complimentary about Trump, but he sent this out today, and I want to read it out. It was a bizarre thing to send out. So here he is. It is very hard, if not impossible, to win a war without attacking an invader's country. It's like a great team in sports that has a fantastic defense, but is not allowed to play offense. There's no chance of winning. It's like that with Ukraine and Russia. Crooked and grossly incompetent Joe Biden would not let Ukraine fight back, only defend. How did that work out? Regardless, this is a war that would never have happened if I were president, blah, blah. Zero chance. Interesting times ahead. President DJT. Now, let's just read that again. It says, it's very hard, if not impossible, to win a war without attacking an invader's country. It's like a great team in sports that has a fantastic defense, but is not allowed to play offense. There is no chance of winning. It is like that with Ukraine and Russia. Crooked and grossly incompetent Joe Biden would not let Ukraine fight back, only defend. How did that work out? Regardless, this is a war that would never have happened if I were president. Zero chance. Interesting times ahead. Now, if you read that, I would think that it sounds like Trump is threatening Russia. He's going to use Ukraine to attack Russia, because it says interesting times ahead, and then it says, "What do you without attacking an invader's country?" Now, of course, that's quite an absurdity. The analogy doesn't really work, because you can absolutely win a war by not attacking an invader's country. You just keep raising the costs for the invader. I mean, you could say that the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, and the Viet Cong, whether you can say they defeated the United States, they managed to avoid getting defeated by the United States, which is all that they needed to do. But they didn't attack the United States. So you can absolutely can prevail just by raising the costs for an invader. You don't have to go and invade somebody else's country, which is very, very difficult to do, because if you don't have the resources, you're just going to expend your limited resources um, by doing something totally stupid. So if the North Vietnamese decided to make an attack on the United States, that would have been a completely stupid and ridiculous thing. So um, and so that I mean, the argument was, of course, absurd. And in any case, Ukraine has attacked Russian territory. It's been attacking Russian territory consistently, through drones, missiles, and so on. And in fact, it did invade. Russia did invade Kursk to no great success. I mean, mostly it was indeed a misuse of scarce resources. So it was a bizarre thing for him to send out, particularly when he'd just been claiming that he's the peace president. He's trying to bring peace. He's saying, I got to bring this. I want to bring the killings to an end. And now he's saying, well, Ukraine should somehow, when you invaded Russia, how would that have brought the killings to an end? To say that somehow the Biden administration stopped Ukraine from doing this. Well, he didn't. Ukraine did invade and has repeatedly attacked Russian territory. I mean, it's like, but if you're much smaller than Russia, as Ukraine is, and you have limited resources, then is that the best use of your resources to invade your much bigger neighbor? I mean, it's an absurd thing to say. But it's clear that he's threatening Russia. There are interesting times ahead. Where was all the talk about peace? I thought you were going to do. I thought you're the peace president. So anyway, so that's Sinoka says Putin made a huge miscalculation by not taking care of the SMO in a decisive manner. Yeah, and I think that's why I wanted to start today's discussion with what the Soviet Union did and why the Soviet Union was successful for many years, until for some reason they decided to abandon the kinds of things that it actually used to do rather effectively. And you got to get these things. It's the first rule of war. First rule of war is you got to get it out of the way quickly. You got to get this done quickly, because once you fail to win, then it's really anybody's. There's all sorts of things. That's why even at this stage, if we look at Russia, yes, Russia is gradually, step by step, prevailing, but still anything can go wrong. As long as the war is continuing, anything at all can go wrong. It can easily escalate into something much bigger and much more dangerous. So yeah, I mean, that's exactly what Putin should have taken care of the SMO in a decisive manner. Did you see Trump's Truth Social today, basically saying Ukraine can only win if it strikes deep inside Russia? I feel a flip-flop coming. I don't see him abandoning Ukraine. I think that's right, and I think that it's possible that he's realizing that all this, these ridiculous things that he has been saying about the imminent peace are indeed absurd. Russia never gave any kind of a commitment to accept security guarantees, security guarantees by the NATO powers, accepting U.S. air power in Ukraine. Russia never accepted that. And Russia has been very consistent. I did a podcast yesterday, which you can look at, where I talked about the Russians have been saying the same thing since Istanbul. They brought this up in Istanbul. Security guarantees means security guarantees by a number of powers, Certainly some of the NATO powers, but it's the security guarantees involving Russia, involving maybe China, maybe Turkey. And there would have to be an agreement among all of the powers, all of them, um, that Ukraine's integrity, territorial integrity, had been violated, or the neutrality commitment had been violated. So that was what the Russians were talking about, the security guarantees. Yeah, we will be one of the guarantors along with NATO powers. The Russians would never in a million years accept security guarantees issued by the NATO powers, because that's of course just bringing NATO into Ukraine. I don't know whether Trump understood this or whatever, but it's clear because Lavrov has spoken about this in on three separate occasions just in the last few days. So he did again. He went into great detail about what he meant by security guarantees, and he meant by that exactly what the Russians meant in Istanbul in the spring of 2022. All of the great powers would guarantee Ukraine's neutrality and territorial integrity, and there would have to be an agreement among all of the powers that a violation has occurred, and then they can use force in order to address that violation, but not just a one-sided guarantee, which would be simply a guarantee for war, because then the NATO powers could deem anything as, oh, look, the Russians are violating Ukraine's territorial integrity, therefore we are entitled to take military measures against Russia. I mean, obviously they're not going to accept anything like that. So it may be that Trump has now realized this and now thinks that he can apply some pressure against Russia. I don't think that's going to work. I don't think it's not going to be a successful venture. But he he has it's more and more clear that he has mischaracterized what happened in Alaska, and then has been mischaracterizing but what was agreed upon in the meetings at the White House. So a lot of excited talk about imminent security guarantees, and the Russians are absolutely disagreeing with it. And now I think he's a little pissed off. I think he's very disappointed that he's not, his plans, which has got everybody excited, are not going anywhere. So yeah. Anyway, thank you, Sinok. Really appreciate your generosity. And then Cynthia says, Ukraine, U.S. company Flexus plant in Mukachewa was destroyed by destroyed in Russian missile strike. Yes, and this happened today. Yeah, the factory produced electronics like fitness trackers, health monitors, and coffee machines for brands such as Nike, Google, and Lenovo. It had just been renovated in April. Want to bet that factory was making more than just fitness trackers and coffee makers. Yeah, I mean, obviously, anytime Russia hits anything, we're always told that either it's an entirely civilian, only civilians were hit, which is always very very odd, because when you count up the number of civilians who've been killed in this war, it's very very small. So therefore, since the way they're reporting that Russia's only targeting civilians, well, if they were only targeting civilians, there'd be a hell of a lot more civilians killed. Um, or, as you say, oh, well, they're just making coffee machines. Oh, they're not, purely all very very innocent. Yeah. Fitness trackers. Imagine that, fitness trackers. So, yeah, yeah. When I read that, I thought exactly the same as you. Yeah, I like this story that the Russians would waste missiles on hitting fitness trackers. Um, anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then Anne Marie says, maybe I'm wrong, but at the moment, the only politician in Germany I regard as trustworthy when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, Gaza, and also COVID is Sarah Wagenknecht. The AFD seems rather hypocritical to me, above all because they seem to be pro-Israel, and also for their alliance with Elon Musk. I agree with you about Sarah Wagenknecht. I rather like her, and but I thought it's very interesting um, what the German state did to her. I think they created this phony baloney, fake, artificial party of the left. I think it's a clearly a fake party. Anytime a party suddenly emerges out of nowhere without a clear political platform, without any clear ideas on any issues other than something entirely nebulous like, oh, rents are too high in Berlin. Well, you know, I imagine rents are too high in Berlin. I mean, rents are too high in almost any major city. So, oh, well, that's their big issue. Rents are too high in Berlin. But the key was that creating this party, this of the left, without any, which stands for nothing, that pushed Sarah Wagenknecht below the 5% threshold, and that ensured that she didn't get into. Her party didn't win any seats in the Bundestag elections earlier this year, and they still haven't recovered in the polls, and that's why I am sure, though I don't have the evidence as yet, but I am sure that this party of the left is a creation of the German intelligence services. Um, Much as I think that the Greens were a creation of the German intelligence services, they wanted a party of the left, which was not the Social Democrats. I think the Social Democrats, the Americans always hated the Social Democrats, always suspicious of the Social Democrats, and so they created a party like the Greens, which also kind of didn't really stand for anything other than something idiotic, like, hey, let's not have any more manufacturing industry. You know, it was obviously ridiculous, isn't going to succeed. And lo and behold, in no time at all, this party, this peace party, the Greens, are the biggest advocates of war, and they have been now for many years. You know, we're going back to the 1990s and the wars in Yugoslavia. So I'm sure that's what happened in Germany. I don't know about the alternative für Deutschland. You know, I don't think they're quite as strongly pro-Israel as other right-wing parties are in Europe. Or maybe they are, but it seems to be a um, a real problem for all of the parties on the right, you know, the conservatives and nationalists, is they're all absolutely beholden to Israel. It's unfortunate, but I mean, I think that's true of Viktor Orban, you know, who obviously has very sound instincts on many things, but is an absolutely a fanatic on Israel. I think it's true about the Dutch guy, Geert Wilders. I think it's true about Nigel Farage. So all of these movements are extraordinarily pro-Israel. I haven't noticed that the AFD is any more intensely pro-Israel than any of the other right-wing parties. So it's kind of pretty much par for the course um, for the parties of the right. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess the Elon Musk. I don't think that. I thought that the alliance with Elon Musk would actually serve them better than it did. I thought that, well, now that they've got this richest man in the world with this huge platform on their side, and he's given them this airing. He had an interview with her. I thought this was really going to be very effective for the AFD, but it didn't turn. It turned out he didn't do anything for her. I mean, they might as well not have bothered talking with Musk, and I mean that surprised me. That Musk, I guess Musk just doesn't carry any kind of weight in Germany. So yeah, I think that was more of a miscalculation. So, but I have you know, I have to be honest that you know that I have to support those who are better than, or who are less, not as bad as the others, because the other parties in Germany are so ghastly. The Merz's party is horrible. The Social Democrats are dreadful with that Boris Pistorius. the Greens with Angela Baerbock, not Angela, Annalena Baerbock, are dreadful. This phony left party, I think, are pretty terrible. So I have to think, well, okay, you know, who's there to support? Well, I like Sarah Wagenknecht, but she's not even able to get to the 5%. So, it's like, you just have to go with whatever, what's the best option. I mean, that's the best there is. So you might as well go with the best there is. You 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 go to you go into a war with the army you've got, not with the army that you'd like to have. So, and I think that's true in other countries as well. However much you may not like Nigel Farage, he's still not as bad as the others. Le Pen isn't as bad as Macron. So I think that's my feeling about the AFD. So whatever your reservations, well, it's better than the others. So anyway, thanks so much, Anne Marie. And then Robert says, Mearsheimer argues that Trump wants to get a shot of Ukraine, but can't be seen to want to. Trump's strategy is to fob the war effort off on Europe while still posing as a cheerleader. Selling weapons to NATO is a part of the pose, as Trump knows the Europeans have no money to buy them. I know, I'm familiar with this argument that Trump, this is part of Trump's kind of 10D chess ploy. Um, I just I have my doubts. First of all, the Europeans have no money to buy them. They will buy them. They'll come up with the money. I mean, since they're ready to sacrifice so much for Ukraine, they're going to come up with money from somewhere. They'll borrow it. They'll they'll launch inflation. They're going to do. Trump cannot get himself out of this war by fobbing it off on Europe. I mean, the Europeans are just going to keep sucking him into this war. The only way he can get out of this war is by getting out of the war. If he continues, whether if you're selling arms to Ukraine, the war goes on. I mean, that's it. The war goes on, and he becomes, he hasn't brought peace, and therefore he becomes responsible for the war. I mean, there's no way. The only way he can not be responsible for the war is by not being responsible for the war, by simply saying, that's it. I'm not sending over. But the idea that somehow if he sells the weapons rather than give the weapons, he's not responsible for the war. Well, of course he's going to be responsible for the war. The arms are coming from the United States, and that means that the war is continuing because of the United States. And these arms are being used to kill Russians, and they're keeping the war going. It's already 7 months since he's been president. So if it continues, then you say, well, hey, this war's been going on now, was it 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 months into your presidency? It's no nearer to any conclusion than it was before. So he will be responsible for the war. I don't know that he's going to be able to, get himself out of it. The Europeans are not going to allow Trump to start, hair splitting that they're responsible and he isn't. It's, they're all in it together, whoever's paying for it. And Trump's claim that it'll be the Europeans paying for it, you have to take that with a pinch of salt. I'm sure that ultimately the Americans are going to be paying for it, because the Europeans are going to come to the Americans and say, hey, can you lend us money, or can you guarantee the loans and whatever? I mean, the Americans were going to end up paying for it. Trump is not going to get himself out of it. This is this whole thing of that it's all going to be Europeans' money. They're going to ask for loans, and the Americans are going to guarantee loans. So I think Americans are still going to be in it unless Trump is willing to get out of it. And you just can't kind of square the circle in this way. I mean, he's the way he did in Anchorage. The Russians have made clear what their terms are. Now, you don't like the terms, then you can just simply shrug your shoulders and accept that, or um, you continue with the war to no particular end. But Trump really hasn't done that. I mean, after Alaska, he had the opportunity essentially to tell Zelensky, well, that's it. The jig is up. But instead of that, he allowed the coalition of the willing to swamp the White House. And so, therefore, effectively, it meant that the war goes on. That doesn't mean there's going to be security guarantees or forces on the ground, but it does mean that the war continues. And that's what Trump ensured by allowing that whole, gathering at the White House. And that's what the Europeans did. Europeans know perfectly well that they're not going to send any forces in as long as the fighting continues. And there's no prospect of the fighting coming to an end. So that means, what they wanted to ensure was that Trump was still on board with their Ukraine project. And I think Trump is still on board, irrespective of who's going to pay for what and how this money is going to be allocated. But they're going to find the money somehow. It's too many vested interest in that. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert, and thank you everybody who has joined me, and thank you for all of your really interesting comments and suggestions, opinions. Really, really stimulating. And we will be back. We're going to do some podcasts over the weekend. Then on Monday, we'll do our joint live stream with Peter. And then Tuesday, I'm going to do my solo. Hope to see everybody then. Until then, thank you, and good night, goodbye, and see you soon. All the best. Bye-bye.